So, hello everybody, and welcome to the now 6th installment of the Race and Revolution lecture series. I, for one, am particularly excited about tonight's speakers as we have both Kimberly Foster and Juliana Huxtable in conversation with us tonight. For those who don't know, Kimberly Foster is a writer, cultural critic, and founder and editor-in-chief of Black feminist community and YouTube channel For Harriet. And Juliana Huxtable is as well a writer, artist, Guggenheim Fellow, DJ, and co-founder of the New York-based nightlife project Shock Value. She's also one of our very own Bard alumna of 2010 and author of Mucus in Our Pineal Gland. And then, of course, we have another one of our very own, Roger Berkowitz, who's the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center, who is sponsoring today's event. So enough of me chatting. Let's get right into it. Roger.
Well, thank you, Sky, and thanks to both Kim and Juliana for being here. It's a special pleasure for me to also have Juliana here because she was a student of mine back in the day, and it's always amazing to see them thrive and surpass ourselves. So that's great. And I'll also thank Sky for basically co-curating this lecture series with me and the Hannah Arendt Center this year. It's been going great. Thrilled to have you all here. Just a reminder that the 7th installment will happen on Thursday of this week with two people who actually are both returning to Bard, who've been here for a number of talks. The Reverend Jackie Lewis, who was at our conference on racism and anti-Semitism last year, and Kenyon Adams, who was also at that conference and also was a Hannah Arendt Center Senior Fellow, National Endowment of the Humanities Fellow last year. So they'll be both speaking on Thursday of this week at 6 o'clock, and hope you can rejoin us for that conversation, which will have a question of the theological aspects and artistic and theological aspects of what it means to think about race and revolution today. So I thought we'd start simply by asking both Kimberly and Juliana sort of like what Sky and I, when we talked about this at the beginning, thought were the sort of basic questions of this lecture series, which is, one, are we in a revolutionary moment? Is this a time when a revolution in race relations is happening? Two, should there be a revolution happening? Are we in need of a revolutionary moment? And three, if so, what's the goal? What's the end point? What are we fighting for? This is sort of how Sky and I started the series. We all sort of know what we're fighting against, but what are we fighting for? What is the aim of a new revolution in race relations if we in fact need one? So I thought I'd let Juliana and Kimberly both start by sort of taking a crack at that sort of foundational question for the lecture series, and we'll have a conversation, and then we're really hoping that we can let lots of you in for Q&A, both through the chat function and through the raise hand function, and I'll remind you how to use it after they talk. Juliana, you want to start?
Sure. I do feel like right now we're in a revolutionary moment. I think that, like, for me, a revolution implies a sort of groundswell of kind of energy that seeks to overthrow a current system or state that is failing in meeting the like basic needs of its people, or is just exploiting its people that fall under its control or ambit. And I think that I've almost waited my whole life. I've kind of waited for a moment where I could see the political ideals that I felt manifest on such a wide scale. I think that there's a question for me as if we are in an actual revolution. It definitely feels revolutionary. I think so many interests have coalesced there, and that energy is reaching a point where it has a kind of like groundswell that is now in an explosive moment. And so while it feels revolutionary, I don't know if it's a revolution. Part of my reticence around that is from is the question of violence. For me, I think there is there's a relationship, at least historically, between what we understand to be revolutions and a kind of violent overthrow of especially a particular state or economic regime. And I think that overthrow feels very necessary in the United States on some level. And so, but I don't feel that there is violence happening right now. And so on the one hand, I think that like my historical understanding of revolutions implies that, but there's also reticence because there's a lot of rhetoric from kind of right-wing thinkers, pundits, like news sources that are basically suggesting that we are in a moment of revolution now. And so saying like even there's been like senators saying that just the election of people like AOC or the Squad or something like that is tantamount to the French Revolution, or that demands to sort of like end white supremacy, even just as a rhetorical strategy on the part of activists, is tantamount to some sort of truly violent action. And so I'm kind of torn in how to assess whether or not it is an actual revolution. And then I guess there's also a third perspective, which I think is somewhat always true in these situations, which is that it's hard to understand if something is a revolution until after the fact, until it has like transformed what we understand to be daily life. But regardless, I think that ending state-sanctioned violence against Black people in the United States is necessary and has been happening just without reform for so long. And somehow this moment that we're in with the coalition, with I think media has changed everything, and media has kind of transformed like the power that the kind of Black Lives Matter movement as an extension of a long Black radical tradition. I think that media, and social media in particular, has corroborated claims that Black people have been making for years. And so that has amplified and caused a shift in, you know, public opinion and public sentiment surrounding these things. And I guess another thing that I do find kind of interesting, thinking about sort of the distinction between a revolutionary moment and a rebellious energy collectively and revolution itself, is that I do think that there's a conscious preparation amongst large parts of the population in the US for actual, at least armed rebellion, arguably revolution itself. And so in getting ready for this, I started, because I've already had that as a sort of gut feeling just from being in my feed and being around my friends and discussions and seeing what's happening through my feed, particularly since I've been out of the country. I'm not in the States, I'm in Berlin. So a lot of what's happened, at least since March, I've witnessed solely via conversations with friends of mine in media. But like gun sales, like Black Americans are the largest increase in gun sales in the United States. And across the board, groups that otherwise were almost like not even catered to or thought of as markets for gun sales have increased. Gun sales among women, gun sales amongst self-identified LGBT people, and gun sales, African Americans being the single largest kind of jump demographically in gun sales. And so I think that's interesting to think about the question of revolution itself as something that people are planning for, or that is precipitating in collective expectations.
Great. Thank you so much, Juliana. Kimberly, do you want to sort of take a crack at the same kind of question, or you can either respond or go off on your own way?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. First, I want to note that I'm looking down because I'm taking notes on my phone. I know it looks really, really bad, so I just want to put that out there. I have to keep up. I have ADHD. I got to write the thoughts down. So my first thought is that we certainly need a revolution. Far too few people in this country have the ability to live lives of dignity and security. We see that especially clearly during the pandemic, where millions of people have lost their access to insurance, they've lost their homes, they've lost their ability to feed themselves and their children. We have probably a generation of children who will never recover because of their education being disrupted, because our schools serve so many purposes. We have no social safety net in this country. So we absolutely need a revolution. I do think that at this point, it's too soon to tell. I agree with Juliana there. But as hopeful as I am by some of the movement that we've seen this year, particularly over the summer, just over the past week, I'm reminded that so many people are fighting against their best interests. We usually have this conversation, we talk about white women, right? And how, you know, white women don't know what's best for them and they vote for patriarchy, and poor white people vote for the wealthy. But I have had so many conversations with people of color about marginal tax rates, right? And I've had these conversations with people about marginal tax rates because there's been so much discussion about the Biden plan with regard to how we are going to tax the rich, tax people who make over $400,000 a year, right? And marginal tax, I'm not going to get into the marginal tax rates, but y'all know, y'all are smart, right? And so I'm having these conversations with people who are living lives of precarity, people who make less than $50,000 a year in their households, right? And we're talking about why we need to tax the rich, why we need to have this money so that we can all have access to healthcare, have this money so we can have better infrastructure, right? And these are people who don't know, they don't have money, they don't have 401ks, they don't have IRAs, right? And they're like, that's not fair, right? And I'm like, do you understand that you are advocating on behalf of the people who, they don't need your help, right? The people who are making $500,000 a year and up, they don't need you to lobby for them. They have good accountants, they have healthcare, they have secure home spaces, right? So I'm consistently reminded of the fact that despite the fact that we are more and more people are coming into consciousness around the need for universal healthcare, the need for potentially a universal basic income, the need for better funding of schools, right? That we are consistently, as much progress as there is, there's always going to be a pushback. And I think that is absolutely what we're seeing right now. I agree with Juliana around this idea of how every time there's a little bit of a march of progress, there is a consistently strong and maybe even like more potent, like a conservative pushback. I'm thinking about how conservatives weaponize the language of revolution, how we've seen Donald Trump dig into that old school, like racist law and order, like messaging, and how effective that is. I've talked to a couple of political scientists who are saying like, law and order is a lot of voters, like that's like one of their top 3 things, right? And how, you know, and also I was thinking about how Kamala Harris just did this interview, and the interviewer said, "Are you a socialist?" And she was like, "No way, I'm not a socialist." And it's like, who's calling this woman a socialist, right? But by conservatives being able to weaponize the language of equality, to weaponize the language of injustice, it puts those of us who are trying to march toward progress consistently on the defense, right? And so we consistently have to explain why everybody should be able to eat, like why nobody should be kicked out of their homes in the pandemic, right? We just haven't been able to adequately like change the terrain of the debate. We are always trying to justify things that just are common sense. And so with regard to like, I don't know, is this a revolutionary moment? I'm not sure. The potential is there. I've certainly seen a lot of individuals have revolutionary transformations, but structurally, broadly, I'm just not seeing it.
Roger, your mic is off.
I'm going to unmute myself. Thank you both. And I want to just pick up on 1 or 2 things you both said, and then let Sky as well, but we can start a conversation, and either of you can respond as well to what each other have said. You know, I'm wondering to what extent you both talk about this being a revolutionary moment, and there's a groundswell and a need. And Juliana is even talking about a kind of potentially armed revolutionary moment. Is it a revolution around race relations, or is it more of a revolution around, you know, the safety net, education, and other things that Kimberly mentioned? You know, I was reminded by Ian Henny Lopez when I interviewed him on a talk last week that the last election in which the Democrats got a majority of the white vote was 1964 with Lyndon Johnson. Is that going to change at some point? Is that changing? Are we seeing, are we seeing a break in that law and order coalition? What would that mean? Or is it sort of more status quo and more of the same and the kind of reaction that Kimberly, you were just talking about? So I'm wondering if you see like a real difference. Are things actually changing, or is it more a lot of talk, but we don't really feel things are changing so much?
I certainly think so. I listen every day to the New York Times podcast, The Daily. And this morning, they had a conversation with white suburban women, like the elusive white suburban woman, like the demographic who, I'm obsessed with this is real political because I'm obsessed because we're 8 days out from an election, right? But the suburban white women are supposed to be the key to whoever's going to win the election. And they were having conversations with these women, a lot of whom, some voted third party in 2016, a couple voted for Trump in 2016. And the conversation is about what's changed for you. And now they're Biden voters, right? And the conversation was about what's changed for you? What's happened? And so many of them talked about these personal awakenings, realizing I didn't know it was that bad, or I didn't know how I was participating in this system, or I don't want to raise Derek Chauvin. Derek Chauvin is the officer who kneeled on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds or however. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I've never heard that kind of talk before. There's a great book by a woman named Jenna Arnold called Raising Our Hands, which is about that elusive suburban white women. And she was talking about these transformations that she's seeing, something that she has never experienced before. And so with regard to that, I think that there's a lot of possibility there. If that energy can be sustained, if the people who wield and weaponize, who have the ability to wield and weaponize their power the way that white women do, if they deeply invest in that kind of transformation, in teaching their children differently, in speaking to their husbands differently, right? In compelling, lobbying for different policies in their suburban communities, like that can lead to real change. That is an area where I am actually, I don't know, kind of bullish on. But there are also areas where I'm like, oh no, I don't know. Maybe in 6 months from now, like what's it gonna be? In 4 years from now, what's it gonna be? I think it's really important for us to really, I don't know, make the most of this opportunity. Make hay while the sun shines.
Well, I really appreciate it. I mean, I think it's important to say what we're bullish on, right? I mean, that's sort of, there is, and I think you're saying something very important. Juliana, are you bullish on that as well? Love to hear your thoughts.
I am, and I think I would agree with what Kim is saying. I also feel kind of relating that to this question of whether or not we are in a moment in which there's just an elevated energy, an elevated agitated energy, a rebellious kind of energy, and whether or not that is revolutionary. One of the things that makes that question really difficult for me is so one, the fact that this moment right now and the pandemic is something that's almost kind of been a catalyst for all of this energy, like the precarity of people is that much more on display, the need for a revolution is that much more on display, but at the same time, it's hard to not know if this feeling, that interest are coalescing, because I do feel that it's not just a race. I don't think that it's just a kind of like single lens, racially motivated moment. Like I think that questions surrounding, like she was saying, universal basic income, sort of like healthcare, labor concerns, like all of these things are housing and a right to housing and the eviction crisis and all of these things that are coalescing. It's hard for me to distinguish between whether or not that energy coming together is reflective of a kind of the kind of intuitive movement of a revolutionary energy, or if it is just the kind of faction building that has to happen as a result of the fact that we're just close to an election. And so whether or not the spectacle of uprisings and whether or not this is a revolution, and the weaponization of that itself is all just going to either already is just a byproduct of concerns and anxieties that we all have every 4 years leading up to an election, or if that will be somehow dissipated as a result of the fact that it happens to align with an election year. And I think trying to separate, and that's been a discussion that's been on so many minds lately, is the relationship between the relationship between non-electoral action, so organizing, mutual aid, kind of on the ground community building for alternatives to policing, like how do we deal with domestic violence? How do we find like other real alternatives to these seemingly all-powerful institutions that we really are invested in kind of dismantling. And so it's really hard to understand how to separate the questions of how much of our emotions, how much of our energy, and how much of our, like, even to me, like your spiritual energy gets consumed in electoral politics. And I do agree this is a moment in which we have to like get Trump out, and that in and of itself is an important question, but it's really hard to understand that question that you're asking because of where we're at right now.
One thing that I think both of you really have achieved is creating your own movements in some way. I mean, Kim, you've created For Harriet and other platforms that have really mobilized a community and a group of people. And Juliana, through your art, you've done similar things. I'm wondering, you know, Juliana used the word groundswell in her talk. I'm wondering, does the groundswell, has it changed in the last 6 months since George Floyd? Do you feel that energy in a way that's, is it productive? How do you imagine these institutions that both of you have built, these followings, how are they working or not working to actually, besides the political coalitions that Juliana's mentioned, to make change that might be revolutionary or not?
Yeah. I would say one way that for me has changed quite dramatically in the last 6 months, and that I'm quite thankful for, is the relationship between kind of language and political expectations. So I was watching the post after the last debate, Cornel West and Trisha Rose's podcast, and they had Brianna Joy Gray, Bernie Sanders' former press secretary, on, and she made a point that I think is really interesting, where a lot of the claims that were placed, especially something like defund the police and abolish prisons, there was this idea that just on face, even as a statement, completely absurd, inaccessible, you're alienating people, you're pushing them to the sideline. And that point was brought up to her as almost like that the utterance itself is somehow impractical to really achieving the political ends that we all can agree we're fighting for. And she actually brought up the point that there's been an important kind of misunderstanding of language, in the sense that people like the Clintons, these kind of like sort of like neoliberal political oligarchs, were actually really effective at using the language of intersectionality, using the language of like radical systemic change. And so language itself has both been used to mislead people, in the sense that like offering them the language that would seem radical or invested in kind of some sort of radical change, while at the same time literally promoting the opposite in terms of policies and how they materially affect people. And so much work is being done right now, I think, in terms of understanding the importance of language. I think language overall is so important. So many of the polarizations, especially that you see online, are over like language and who has a stake in them and what they mean. And I'm particularly thankful that I think there has been quite a radical shift. And I think that the shift in public opinion is because of work that people like Kimberly are doing. Like, I remember when I first found For Harriet, I was just like, my mind was exploding, because I loved that there was such at the same time, like rigorous and thoughtful and uncompromising in terms of like what language we are allowed to discuss and insist on in its importance, but also really mediating and making it accessible and open to discussion to the people that it's useful for, and the larger like Black audience, and a Black audience that is interested in questions surrounding what like Black feminist thought and discourse could be useful for. And so I do think overall there's like a shift in how language is deployed, and maybe even the relationship between kind of what we understand to be language, and thinking even kind of moving out from language, media, and action and political action. Because for me, there's this kind of there's this historical model, like when I think of my parents and the way that they understand politics, where it's like there's activists that are on the ground, and then there's sort of musicians and cultural producers, and there's like a very clear distinction between those two, and even like sort of like academics. And so there are people that are invested in ideological revolution or ideological change, but ultimately there's some sort of hard line between them and on the ground organizing. And part of what has both made the current moment so difficult to understand, because the kind of political and corporate institutions, their means of control are so much more multifaceted and are beyond what we understand to be the literal political or the literal economic. So it makes the question so much more complicated and difficult. But I also think, particularly in these last 6 months, the shift in how we understand our approaches to that multifaceted, kind of very messy relationship between these societal factors is changing. And so that has been, I think, exciting and somewhat contemporary to this moment.
Yeah, I've been trying to think a lot about what my work is, especially as we had that moment over the summer. And I love and value so much the number of people who have come to me. Well, nobody has come to me because we're in a pandemic, but who have DM'd me and sent me notes about how I have helped them to rethink or clarify or reimagine or define. I really take that seriously, because I know that there have been many times in my life when I've had to undergo those sorts of processes, and I'm still learning and rethinking and reimagining. I think that is really, really important. I really believe that if you're not helping, you're hurting, and I want to help. But I do think that something I'm trying to be very clear on is I am a person who makes stuff for the internet, and I want to help people get to their revolutionary, their radical transformations. But and I don't want to create the binary that Juliana was talking about between cultural producer and activist, but I do know that the real work, the hard work, is the people who are putting their bodies on the line, who are out in the streets, who are being arrested. I always want to underscore anytime that I'm speaking that yes, like knowledge is important, sharing information, teaching, that is important, but we're not getting anywhere if people are not actually willing to risk things. And I love to do this, and I definitely have gotten some shit for for standing really strong and firm in my beliefs. But there are people who are risking a lot more, who are giving up a lot, right? Who are literally dying. So I always want to make sure that I'm pointing people that way, that if you have surplus resources, that you are investing it in those people. That if you have knowledge or know-how, if you are a lawyer or whatever, like that you are helping those people. I think a part of my work at this time is making people really understand that like the apparatus that are going to get us to freedom are like multifaceted, right? And so we can't just invest in one and neglect the other. I think about that all the time. I also want to, so many people have also come to me, Black folks, but like people of all different races have come to me and said, how can I help? Like, what work needs to be done? I have questions. I try to be as generous with my time as possible without being like a magical negress, which sometimes like people are like, oh, you're taking a little advantage here, right? but I want to be generous with my time because people have been generous with me. So I try to do that as well. But I also try to make sure to point people to, I also want to project this idea that I'm the one, right? That I'm the only smart person who has interesting things to say, that I'm the only person's videos who you should be watching, right? I also want to make sure to underscore that this is a collaborative moment, that any movement is going to be collaborative. So I do think that a foundational part of my work as a cultural producer is just like guiding people, leading people in the right direction, and also always telling the truth. Like that is something I'm so committed to, because there are so many incentives to lie. There are so many incentives, but even if it's not popular today, I know that truth lasts, and so I'm always invested in that.
I kind of want to ask a question that touches on what both of you are talking about, because I see that, well, actually, right before this talk, I actually was watching one of your videos, Ms. Foster, which was about Kamala Harris. And through you, you had said that revolutionaries also have to be realists, which was a quote from Angela Davis. And I hear that viscerally between you both. I hear a lot of, and not just you, I think we'd also had a talk with our student panelists earlier this year, in which they expressed things similar to you. You both, I mean, not to put words in your mouth or theirs, but there isn't this sense of like overwhelming hope and excitement and just fully, or maybe like even like blind naivety to like the idea that revolution is close and possible. And this is something I think shared amongst a lot of people of color, that I think white folk and people who are not, I guess specifically Black, brown, marginalized people of color, understand fully. So I guess I wanted to expand upon that a little bit, upon why you both are so careful with this word revolution, where you think we are at with that, and I guess also probe with Kimberly. I hear you saying also, with you emphasizing wanting to emphasize people actually doing like manual things, being on the ground, actually doing the work of tending to people's material resources. And Juliana's point to language not really catching up to where we are at currently. Are we even in the beginning stages of this? Like, is, for both of you, do you even think that we should be having this conversation yet?
Yeah, I think it's always useful to have the conversation, but I do think that definitions are important, the way that Juliana was talking about. I so agree with Brianna that these ideas, these radical ideas, identity politics has gotten fucked up, intersectionality has gotten fucked up. I think it's so important for us to be really clear about what we mean. And so I think that I'm careful about the use of the word revolution, because, we have it's become a slogan. You put it on a shirt, you make it a meme, but like revolution means people gonna die. It means it means you're gonna lose stuff, right? Like the comfy apartment or the good job or right? You're gonna have to sacrifice things, right? And so I want people to know that, like, to really know what investment in like radical change is, and maybe you're not ready for that, right? And like, if you're not ready for it, let's not just nonchalantly throw the word around. I feel the same way about all sorts of things. Like, I'm a prison abolitionist, and people be like, arrest the cops, but I'm a prison abolitionist. I'm like, that don't. Right? So it's like, okay, so just say you're not ready to embrace like a world without policing and prisons, right? Like, we're all in process. I think it's really important for us to be honest about that. As I mentioned earlier, there are so many incentives to fake it. There are so many incentives to lie. I think we all want to be embraced and loved and told that we're so smart and like, but no, like, let's just be real about it, and real about the consequences of it, I think.
Mm. So I guess it kind of speaks to also what you were saying earlier, that a revolution is needed, but isn't currently happening. A revolution is needed, but is damaging.
Yeah, I don't even think we're close. I don't even think we're close. Yeah, yeah. Sorry, that's a bummer.
No, if it's real, it's real. Can I pass that question also on to you, Juliana?
Sure. I think, like, I love the term, the weaponization of revolution, and the weaponization of the idea of revolution by conservatives. And so thinking of people that are putting their lives on the line, like, I think that there's a difference between revolution and actions for basic human dignity. And I don't want to put people or amplify the actions that people are doing, which I think are actually totally understandable, totally reasonable, not literal revolution in the sense that you don't have to give up your apartment for people to not die at the hands of police constantly, for Black people to not be subjected to constant either state sanctioned or just kind of like vigilante, whatever. I think the culture of like Karen videos, just like terror that so many different types of people, Black people, Indigenous people, are subjected to constantly. And so I'm reticent to say this is revolution, because it almost doesn't allow the work that people are doing now, which is maybe the work that's necessary to precipitate revolution, but is not revolution itself. And by designating it as such now, that is actually playing into a kind of public panic that ultimately is against the interest of what we might ultimately come to see as a revolution. And so that's kind of, I think that's one of the main aspects of that for me. But also I think that there's a history of, to the same degree that ironically it's weaponized, it's also, we live in a country that is romanticized as being birthed by revolution, and the revolutions that most people are willing to, the kind of designation of what is and is not a legitimate revolution is interesting. So it's like, we live in a country that's birthed on the fantasy of a revolution, but arguably, and I actually, there's a quote that I wanted to share from this book called As Black as Resistance. I've been having a lot of conversations surrounding the current political moment, and I've actually been asking myself, maybe I'm actually an anarchist. So what does Black anarchy look like? What does my form of anarchy look like? And so I found this book from William Anderson and Zoe Samudzi, who I'm obsessed with. Also, she has an amazing Twitter. But equating a revolt to escape unfair monarchical taxes to real revolution is a perversion of the concept of revolution itself. How revolutionary were men who saw no problems with enslavement and citizenship based on white manhood and land ownership? And so I think that maybe even playing into the language of revolution doesn't really deal with the complexity of both what that term means historically and how people romanticize specifically the American Revolution and the French Revolution, but at the same time avoid things like the Haitian Revolution. And so on the one hand, there's that kind of just distance that I want to establish from the term. But then on the other hand, I think kind of what I was saying before, in the sense that like state and corporate interests in terms of how they exercise their sovereignty and control and manipulation of political possibility is so much more different than what it's ever been historically. It's encroaching into every aspect of our reality. It's in our medicine, it's in our food, and so the fronts and like the kind of terrain on which we understand something like a kind of political struggle is so much more complicated. I don't know if revolution, as something that's defined to a certain degree via historical precedent and examples, really could ever come to understand what we're doing right now and what's precipitating right now. And that maybe we wouldn't get the cut and dry moment of a literal overthrow. Not that I don't hope for that on some level, but I don't know if we would get that given how complicated and messy of a situation we're generally in. And so that's also a reason why I'm weary to just jump in and say we're in a revolution.
You know what, this is actually making me think that, like, what would a revolution in 2020 look like? Maybe the images that I have in my mind are not non-transferable, right? Like maybe it's not even possible to Okay, sorry. I'm going through like a personal, like, okay, yeah, okay, sorry. We
Well,
can get back.
no,
No,
don't
that's
even start
actually,
this.
I literally Googled that, getting ready for this. I was like, has someone else asked this question? How do we think about this? And I said, I literally Googled, what does revolution look like in 2020?
Yeah.
It's a silly way of approaching that, of approaching the preparation, but that question is, I think, so important. And
But it's
yeah,
also not silly. I also feel like there's a metaphor in the fact that you Googled this, that like
right.
it's
Also
almost
kind of dark that I Googled that.
maybe so. But also in the sense that like what I'm kind of catching from Juliana is that we also might be, which I hope we're not, but as you spoke about like the terrain that is able to be revolutionizable, are we too far into our systems? Are we too far into capitalism that we can no longer, like a cut and dry moment is no longer an option, that like whatever revolution, whatever ideas of revolution that we will have from henceforth won't be what we've had before, because sincerely, we haven't had the advancement of technology that we have today. We haven't had, I mean, capitalism has been able to grow in a way that is kind of incredibly scary and dystopian. And so I do wonder if, or I guess another question for both of you is that like in the complicated, messy world that we're currently in right now, in which everything that we do contributes to our oppression or someone else's oppression, if you would like to, I know it's a big question, but since we're all thinking about it, what do you think aspects of revolution would look like in 2020 or in the future? What would be the redefining of revolution for you both? What would make you feel comfortable saying that word?
You know what? I think this is like an old school, but I think it's like something particular. I think about what does complete divestment from capitalist accumulation look like? Like how could I really, and I'm thinking about this because of all of the varied forms of exploitation that we participate in by constant consumption, like of physical goods, of digital goods, of just like attention, right? Like how can I really free myself of that? And it's like I'm having such a difficult time thinking through, because does that mean I use an iPhone that was made by children who get paid 30 cents an hour to be in connection with my nieces, right? Like I don't know, girl.
No, you don't need to save the world. It's a really good question. Juliana, do you want to try? If not, I have other questions.
I was gonna say I don't feel qualified to even begin. And there are examples that, so I was recently on a panel about abolition and like digital abolition, and someone brought up as an example, and this is sort of immediately what came to mind. And reparations was a major part of what we were talking about, and what do alternatives to, like, if reparations and the historical idea of what they means is no longer possible, what possibilities are enabled by our highly entangled reality right now? And someone brought up the example that kind of mutual aid was a form of reparations. And while I see where they're going, it sort of just felt like my instinct was to say this isn't it, and I don't really feel like I have the ability to assess that. And maybe that could only ever happen after the fact. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
After the fact of like
if there were a new form of revolution, it wouldn't be understood until it had already taken place and was like the transformation was in place, that the transformation of our daily lives was already happening. I don't know if I don't feel like I have any possibility, at least right now, to glean what that would look like. And maybe that's a necessary part of revolution. I don't know, but.
That is understandable. Because I think that what's so easy about like saying the word revolution to begin with is what you both were talking about earlier, is that we have images. We have images of violence. We have images of bombastic change. So it's undeniable whether something has changed or not. It's undeniable whether you were living in a new world or the one before. But you make a great point. we may not know until we're there. But then it almost speaks to ideas of reform in that way. I think a lot of people would speak to, oh, look at the world you're living in now. Like, I am a Black person that gets to go to a PWI, and I don't understand. I've never been in a position in which I have not been in one. I didn't grow up in the 60s. And so I've heard people say this to me, but like people have also said that like, that's where reform comes in. Reform can be the revolutionary change that happens over time. But I have a feeling with Juliana, you saying that you're thinking of being an anarchist, and Kimberly, from the multitude of videos of yours that I've seen, reform is also a very contentious topic in the sense of what that does for actual productive change. So what do you both think about that in regards to reform being an active revolution, or can it be?
I think that reform and revolution are mutually exclusive. I do like the idea that Juliana put forth about advocating for systems that meet our basic needs. Like, we don't have to try to pretend like that necessarily means revolution. I definitely am maybe more open to the idea of mutual aid being kind of a form, like a step toward revolution. I think that there is something very transgressive about the idea that we already have what we need. We just need to come together in community and dole it out, right? Like, we don't need to, like, rejecting the idea of, you know, accumulation and consumption, and really talking about sharing and bartering. Like, there's something there about, it's almost like I don't know, maybe this is I feel like, you know, as a quote unquote progressive, there is kind of this idea of like the state, like we need the state to intervene. And I believe in that, but I'm like, the state keeps failing. You know, at some point we're gonna have to accept that the state is just gonna keep failing. So we gotta do something else. That's it for me. I don't know.
That's more than enough. I almost feel like Juliana's anarchy then is almost like the answer.
Yeah.
Not in the anarchy.
I don't know if I would have posited that as an answer yet. This is as a result of my inability to come to what I felt like were solid conclusions, and particularly my relationship to the state was so contentious that it made me feel like I think I have to explore anarchism as a possible like political ideology that I could interface with. And so I'm at the very beginning of that journey. So I don't want to commit to that as an answer.
No worries. You do not have to be an expert. It's just really interesting ideas that you're dealing with. But yeah, all right. I think I kind of want to switch gears a little bit because I think we may have hit the end of this thread of conversation. But I want to ask what kind of role each of your personal professions play in where you stand and where you stand in your politic, how you are using your career and your work towards your politic, and whether you can see bombastic, maybe even radical or revolutionary change happen within each of your fields, and towards what.
I guess I do a lot of different things. I have a hard time sticking with one thing. Like I make music, I write, I do a lot of speaking. I also DJ. There's all sorts of things that I do. And for me, maybe I think, and I don't draw, I would never say like I agree with Kim in that one of the things that frustrates me so much is the equation of advocacy with activism. And so there's this sort of idea that being someone who has really radical quotables and is in a GAP campaign as the person that's expanding notions of what's desirable, that is the same thing as activism. Electric chair, I completely disagree with that. And so I don't want to enforce that, and that informs how I relate to my practice. But in terms of the multifaceted nature of what I do, I think that I do operate from a place of urgency. I think I create and make work from a place of urgency and immediacy. And while I wouldn't limit that to the advocacy of like political concerns or political ideals, they are intrinsic to how I approach them. And the fact that I'm doing so many things is sort of a response to what I was trying to get at earlier, in the sense that like what feels urgent to respond to is so messy to me. It's like a Heptra or something. It's this many-headed thing where you swipe at one and then the head comes from somewhere else. And so what drains and what places strife and what burdens that I then feel that I need to respond to, and where that urgency comes from, is quite multifaceted. And so I feel like, as an artist who somewhat agrees with Nina Simone's idea that artists are responding to the questions of their time, it has to kind of be multifaceted. Like I couldn't do the traditional idea that I just sit and make images or something like that. That doesn't feel like, for me, a way to embody in my practice the urgency that I feel and the complicated nature of that urgency.
Yeah, with my platform, I'm always trying to embrace and communicate this idea that I'm not the teacher. Like I'm not sitting up high, right? There's this idea of like pedagogical, like teaching, right? Like we're in dialogical learning. Like I have the platform, yes, and I'm making the videos, yes, and generally the audience is consuming me. But I do read comments and I do read emails, and people send me books and links all the time, right? Like we are learning from each other. And so I always want to underscore that like the process of getting to where we need to go is going to be a process. And all of us are consistently in process. And I was just thinking of this Octavia Butler quote from Parable of the Sower, and it's all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. And I guess I'm trying to prime my audience constantly that like the terrain is always shifting, and that shifting, we don't need to resist it. We need to embrace that shifting, go with the shifting, because the shifting is what's going to get us freer. It's what's going to help you live a life where you can have access to healthcare, where you don't have to be exploited, right, by your corporate overlords, right? Like I do think that some of the things that we are holding tightly to, we are doing it not because they serve our best interest or the greater goods. We are doing it because we are afraid of what comes next. And so I do feel like my responsibility is to continually communicate that evolution is natural, that evolution is good, that there is no progress with evolution, and that evolution is messy, right? Transformation is hard and it's messy, and you're gonna fall out with people, and you're gonna hate yourself. Like there's been days where I've been like, I'm a piece of shit. Like I'm participating in these systems. Like how can I divest from that? How can I move away from that? But that work is necessary, it's integral, and ultimately it's worthwhile. That's what I'm always trying to convey.
And just to add on to that, what in particular, like in those moments in each of your work, in each of your days, makes that work feel worthwhile? Because I know even in this conversation, I guess we've talked about how we're barely at the beginning of even conceptualizing what a revolution would look like. And so, and as many older activists had said, you're likely not going to see the results of the change that or the work that you have done in your lifetime. So what are the things that make it worthwhile for you, or that make it, that motivate you to keep doing it, if that's okay?
What I am, the best things in my life right now are my relationships. Investing in transformation, letting go of all of these ideals have helped me to mostly relinquish the desire to to dominate, right, in my interpersonal relationships and to participate in domination. And so by letting that go, I've been able to get so much closer to the people who I care for and who care for me. We've developed a new level of intimacy and honesty, a deeper level of commitment to each other. And by investing in community and communion, it helps me to divest from the outside stuff, to divest from making as much money as I can, and do I need a nicer car, and let me telegraph my credentials, and all of that stuff that I've been in my life so wrapped up in, but I know that are ultimately so destructive. Just really care for myself and care for other people. That's what I've gotten out of this so far.
That is beautiful. Can I also ask that question to Juliana?
I would second, I think being in communion with people and being able, feeling like I'm not someone who creates in isolation. I don't feel like I create in a void. I create in conversation with people. Like my least favorite form of displaying art is sending it to an art fair, even if I need to do that to make money. I love making shows because people get to be there. I make art with and in community with my friends, and the kind of it's meant to be in distribution. It's meant to be in conversation. And so for me, the most rewarding thing is the kind of like conversations and community participation that comes as a result of making various types of work. This is also why I'm invested in nightlife. We haven't really talked about that so much because it might not seem so relevant to what we're talking about, but it's all up. There is no form of, it's almost like an alternative to a church model. I grew up in the church. I love the church. I love being in communion with people that I love and seek to love, and that love expanding beyond the specifics of my relationship with you, and the sort of like ethics and community making and the kind of cultural production that comes from that place of collectivity is really important for me. And so when I feel like that is illuminated and alive and present, either as a result of or in the work itself, that's when I feel, okay, this is why I do this.
Thank you both for both of those answers and the entirety of this conversation. I know you have a lot of eager audience members that are really excited to ask you more questions, and maybe through them we can start to get into maybe more about nightlife and more about tax bracket. And so, yeah, if you'd be willing, Roger, can we transition into Q&A?
Please do. Thank you. I know Tabitha Ewing has a question that really, I think, follows quite nicely from what we're just discussing. Tabitha, do you want to come on and ask it, or should I just read it?
I can try. Hey, Juliana.
Hi, Tabitha. How are you?
So lovely to see you. I guess my question is really about if we're thinking, if our wish list is as grand as it ever could be, could we imagine a world, and I'm thinking historically here, in which statist interventions are less important because the state simply doesn't have that kind of power? In the absence of large bureaucracies and in the absence of the capacity to tax people to make large bureaucracies, then states were really kings with property in very small places. And everybody else was living their lives as they lived them in their parishes or cities or regions and so forth. And where you had, and I'm getting to the question, I promise, where you had a kind of robustness was in civil society, in the ways in which what we would call private organizations, maybe semi-private organizations, structured life that was meaningful for the people who participated in them. And I just wonder where that might exist right now, and whether we can co-opt some of that into our lives in this moment. And when you say nightlife and the way that you describe nightlife, that's exactly what it seems like to me. Those places where it's actually already happening. And it's happening across racial categories as we understand them. It's happening across gender, sexuality categories as we understand them. I mean, there could be a phenomenal bookstore that might be the location for this kind of interaction that then has a productive place in the world. And I just wonder if there isn't a way for us to be more aware of that and also to cultivate that in the absence of trying to get the state to do publicness. Because right now, when we talk about the public, we're either talking about a very amorphous, very, very, very algorithmic and frankly, very corporate understanding of public that is mediated through the internet, or we're talking about a statist form of public. But there is another historical form of public. And I wonder the extent to which that could serve to bring to the fore some notion of or remediate some notion of the present that we're in toward a future that is revolutionary.
I guess I would say, I think for me that it's a question of the distribution of resources and capital. And I think that for my initial fascination when I first moved to New York, what I was so kind of wide-eyed was the way that these illicit economies functioned. And so from the outside, you have people that are drug dealers, that are sex workers, that are just like promoters, but it's all essentially, they were generally cash economies. And what I found so amazing about it was that it, by virtue of being a cash economy, it allowed us to circulate not only capital in the most basic form, but also to circulate resources. And so I think that what was happening in nightlife for me, it's what allowed me to escape a job that I really just like, that I really hated and felt sort of completely subject to, because I couldn't go back, I didn't want to go back to Texas. I wasn't really dealing with my family at that point. And so it provided a completely alternate universe within which I could have not only a sense of being seen socially and participating in a kind of social collective, but it was also where I got medical advice. It was also where I found recommendations for housing and things like that. And so if that is a kind of IRL precedent in certain ways to the more digital model of mutual aid, I do think that's one of the things that's so interesting about mutual aid. It's creating your own relative network for the distribution of money and resources. But what I want to really understand, and I think maybe this is an interesting kind of like work that's yet to be done, and I know that there are people doing this work, so I don't want to suggest that that's not happening, is that the kind of digital, like what you're saying, anything that's mediated through the internet immediately becomes corporate to a certain degree, like kind of like platform capitalism is already such a part of this. I also don't want the kind of mutual aid thing to be fodder for a kind of libertarian fantasy where we move from the state in certain ways, but essentially leave people completely unprotected and others. And so I guess that's an interesting question for me, but I'm always thinking of kind of illicit economies, the economies that we demonize, that are often demonized from the outside, as actually basically microcosms of these possibilities that
I mean, part of what makes me think of that is that I'm right now in the pandemic, I'm living in Vermont, which is, I mean, one of my other questions was really about city country. We can leave that aside for now and pick that up some other moment. But living in the country here where people do trade all the time, there isn't enough cash really to go around. Nobody could survive if they couldn't say, I'll chop some wood for you if you'll give me a couple of chickens to feed my family with tonight. So there is this sense that this kind of thing is actually happening in a world that isn't fully visible to those of us who live in the city full time. And now that I'm actually in the country full time, I really do see actually weirdly enough, the similarities between the two. And the fact that, going back to something that you guys were talking about earlier, there is no conversation between the two of them leads us to believe that the state is our only option. And I wonder what could happen. Again, thinking in a revolutionary framework, if, or maybe because Octavia Butler was mentioned, I wonder if in a fantastic framework or in a speculative framework, country and city could have this conversation, and what you're calling illicit, which is with that which is primordially licit, even though of course it isn't, would be fruitful. And I guess I'll leave it there.
Thank you as always for the historical background, Professor Ewing. It's great to hear from you. And I really appreciate the fact that you're trying to use your knowledge to create an imaginative framework for the future. That's exactly what this is about. So thank you.
So nice to see you, Tabitha.
Yeah, I definitely speak for everyone. That reunion was very cute. But we have another question from a student this time, Rachel Lyons, who asks, I think this goes for both of you. Could you speak more specifically about the use of social media platforms and for advocacy, like ultimately Instagram or Facebook and Twitter, etc., as companies and are not on the side of the people? What do we do with them? I can try and rephrase that if that's helpful.
Yeah, no, I think I kind of understand. I think that we have to be very careful about over-reliance on these platforms. I think that any platform who we know the primary motive is profit, I think we have to be really, really careful. I definitely, since the uprisings of the summer, have been much more hesitant to post where I am on the internet. I'm still very candid, but there are definitely things that I don't say on public forums. I definitely think that the idea that social media is free reign, is prime terrain for organizing. I hope that, like, we've all been disabused of that notion. I just think, you know, the feds are literally watching. So yeah, we just need to be aware of that.
Absolutely. Juliana, do you want to answer that question a little bit? Because I also feel like the queer context within like nightlife in general and being watched and perceived might also be helpful here.
I think I would agree with what Kimberly's saying, and what I would add to that is because I think of this question all the time, especially as someone who I've always been a social media person. Both of my parents were technology enthusiasts. They of all the things, like, I generally don't understand why my parents were married. It seems really shocking to me that they ever even tried. But the one thing that they really agreed on was a strong and fundamental belief in technology as a means for Black people to liberate themselves, to redistribute wealth, to redistribute resources, and to network amongst each other to create an alternative to essentially subjecting themselves to white kind of corporate mobility as the only option for Black people to transform their material conditions. And for me, I think the moment that I realized how sadly complicated things were was like Tumblr. I've always been a blogger. I loved Tumblr. I found a lot of community on Tumblr. I learned so much. I read so much. My understanding of art history, my understanding of political history really expanded via these communities that were forming online. And even though Tumblr was already a company from its outset, I'm sure they had the goal of making it a kind of ad-based profit enterprise. It was when it was purchased by Yahoo, and then because of FOSTA-SESTA regulations, they swiped the entire site of pornography and started targeting people. I realized we really can't trust this. Like, this is not something that I can rely on. Just from the perspective of like building cultural archives, I lost so much like writing and art history and research that I was sharing and building with other people online. And what I really was even more sad about is like, but both of my parents are like my mom is a databasing engineer, and so she's always up to date with the like actual language in which people are building and accessing websites, and how databases are then interfacing with websites. And I really felt like I had played myself by not keeping up to date with the kind of structure, the kind of language and economic, all of the structures that mediate how we then see the user interface, I had forgotten about. And so I think that there is a possibility for a future if more of us take on the burden that because it's a lot of labor of understanding how social media itself is being built so that alternatives can then be built, because we can't have alternatives if we don't understand the basic structure of how these websites function. We are essentially all subject to the user interface. Like that's we're all completely subject to that. And until that changes, I think it's difficult to find alternatives, or at least alternatives that are plausible. And so that's what I hope to see that shift in the future. At one point, I was pretty up to date with that stuff and just fell out when I got to Bard. Bard is not the most tech forward institution, but I also, for other reasons, just fell off. And so I hope that people take up that banner in the future. And I hope that there's more of that, so that we can have alternatives to being subject to Twitter literally as the place in which radical discourse is shared and hashed out.
Kimberly, I think I saw you really deeply in thought and nodding a lot. Did you have a response?
Yeah, I was just thinking about how, you know, I saw in the chat someone say, well, what do we do? Like, how do we organize outside of these platforms? And it's like Juliana mentioned, like there are not options. You know, participation on these platforms is pretty much compulsory if you desire connection, especially in the pandemic. And that leaves a lot of us vulnerable to a super kind of exploitation. So I just had a real kind of a real thought when Juliana was talking about investing in learning these systems. My mother is also an engineer, and every day I know she's mad because I'm not. I know she's mad. but it is important to know how to make things. It is important to understand how the infrastructure works. Otherwise, we will always be subject to the whims of these institutions that don't ultimately have our best interests. And in fact, like they are antithetical to our interests and our needs, you know, their missions. Yeah. So I'm thinking, how can I fund some revolutionary engineers is what I'm thinking. Like, how can we get that?
I like that.
I think that's also what's also really weirdly like roundabout helpful about the internet was that I think I did during June in the Floyd protests, there was a lot of like hacking and like a bunch of young people who didn't know how to make apps. Like I ended up downloading like quite a few like image scrubbing services that were just made. And I think you both are absolutely on something that would be incredibly helpful. And I wonder what that would do for Harriet as well, if you no longer have YouTube to work on, but a different and personal platform for that particular thing.
Yeah, I'm thinking about that now. Totally.
Well, great question. Thank you. Y'all are doing great in the audience. We have another question from a student, from Faith Williams and Ella Baldwin, which is, how do you move within these white capitalist institutions in order to infiltrate/reform while investing in the grassroots groundswell that connects the reality of the movement? How to not get sucked into the restrictions of the institutional practices? That might be.
I don't know. I'm not even sure if I've ever met somebody who really does it like what I would consider. I just think it's so easy. It's so difficult to be in these institutions but not of them. I think they seep into your consciousness, they seep into your bones. I feel myself constantly trying to re-educate myself, reorient myself in the world, unlearn. And I'm not even sure if I will ever be able to get rid of all of the really bad habits that I've learned navigating really white supremacist, ultimately institutions. So don't tell Harvard that. But they already know. But yeah, I don't know. I would say I always default to invest in community. Like the community, the institution won't save you, but the community might.
That is a beautiful quotable moment. The institution won't save you, but the community might. I like that a lot. Yeah, do you have any response to that as well, Juliana?
I'm going to pass the mic on that one. I think Kim said that beautifully.
All right, perfect. All right, let's look at another question then. So the next question comes from Kwame Holmes, who is a professor here at Bard College. He asks, my question is, I've been teaching a class about abolition, and we've been thinking about BDSM and how it mines histories of domination for pleasure. But I'm wondering about the potential of BDSM to make a space for the human longing for power or submission, which is expressed maladaptively through the spectacles of punishment in the criminal justice system or on Twitter. This feels like another form of nightlife that allows us to play out our various selves in consensual relation. Yeah, I think both a comment and a question, but I think that sounds like it was directed at you, Juliana.
I mean, I think for me, so I've had my own personal history in BDSM, and I've even written about that to a certain degree. And for me, I think it's a question of over-identification. Like it's a moment of over-identification to free myself from what I feel is the tyranny of just the ever-present and ubiquitous nature of something. And so before I ever indulged in it, it was just the kind of basic concept that navigating the world as a like femme person, there's the kind of the potential for your sluttiness is constantly precipitating around you. If you show too much cleavage, you're a slut. If you wear something, if you wear too much makeup, or something's too short, or something's too bright. And so it's this constant kind of potential around you that some people, not everyone, can feel that almost holds them hostage to this just like very low level white noise kind of expectation or threat. And so the act of BDSM can be a sort of over-identification with that for the purpose of liberating oneself from the ever-present question that I might be that. And so instead of asking myself whether I might be that, saying I am going to, of my own volition, choose to do this in this moment. And that there is a kind of, I think, for a range for some people of just kind of like libidinal to maybe even spiritual release that comes as a result of that. I think for me that was sort of that was a phase, and I think what's a difficult question that I've even had to face in my own work, having like written and published about my own experiences there, is like, what does that discourse mean when it enters the public? And so on the one hand, I value kind of dissidence in all forms, but I also, without being like respectability politics, I'm like, is this what I want to put out into the world? Is a kind of essentially a form of either like race play or even just kind of woman submission in a BDSM context, what I want to put in the world, and can it be understood without just reinforcing the kind of implicit sadistic pleasure that's already culturally precipitating around those questions. And so that's been difficult. I ultimately am glad that I did publish that, but I think it's a more complicated question of how this relates to spectacles of punishment online and social media. I think those are different. I wouldn't necessarily relate them directly, outside of the fact that maybe those spectacles on social media can amplify one's desire for that kind of over-identification, or whatever desire is motivating one to then participate in kind of BDSM acts. And I think for me, what was also interesting is to think of what it means to, so for me, the tables kind of turned. So when I initially engaged this, I didn't have the idea that I wanted to have a sort of race specific play in mind. I was just entering a more traditional kind of dom sub dynamic. And it was through him essentially asking me what I wanted, what I desired, that this came out. And I was even surprised and a bit shocked by my own desires, but it also was a kind of challenge. I felt like it put the control in my hands of like basically pushing someone to over-identify what their like most politically correct self doesn't want to. So it's like, no, you don't get to back down in this instance. Like in all other circumstances, you want to be so dominant in all of these things, but now when it comes to race, you're terrified of being the thing that I think somewhere in the back of your mind is like, you have to repress in order to feel like a good functioning white liberal. And so there was a kind of power reversal or something happening there. But anyway, I don't know if that answers the question. I'll just stop there.
I kind of want to probe you in that question a little bit further, because you had mentioned something a little bit earlier about like in combating the joy of destruction, you kind of use the joy of creation and the creation in cultural spaces. And what does that mean for this contentious history that you have with BDSM? Like, can that also be a space of creation, I guess, against the status quo in a revolutionary, or I guess in a revolutionary action, but like, what would that, yeah, does that question make sense? I apologize.
So is the question, can you rephrase the question? I'm not.
Yeah, I think the question is BDSM, with all the contentions and complications that you have just mentioned, can that be a space of creation for like of cultural production for like independent revolutionary progress?
I would want to qualify what revolutionary means in that context. I think that for people that choose to engage that, can it be a liberatory experience for individuals? Can it make people feel kind of unshackled by certain forms of social expectation in the way that history is constantly precipitating, especially in questions of desire? Yes, I do think that there is a potential for people to be unshackled in certain ways or feel unshackled. I wouldn't necessarily make the jump that that is revolutionary. Like, I'm reticent generally to, even though there's like a continuum between our sexual experiences and our political experiences, I think that it's important to take the time to carefully apprehend what we mean and what's happening in those spaces. And so I don't necessarily know if I would say it's revolutionary, because I also generally don't, yeah, I'll leave that there. I wouldn't say it's revolutionary, but I do think that it can serve a kind of unshackling or liberatory function for specific people that choose to engage that. Like, it's done that for me. Melina Williams is someone who I think has done a lot of really interesting writing sort of before the current iteration, that's sort of fascinated by all of that. I think that she's been doing a lot of work in writing around her relationship to not only BDSM, but as a masochist and a submissive and a Black woman who's been sort of a vocal advocate within the scene for years. I think that her writing for me is what opened up this gateway to like what over-identification means in that situation, and what the opportunity to demand of your partner, to demand of your dom, like that they do this, what that does, and what can, a feeling of what can be reclaimed or redistributed within that moment in terms of power dynamics. So I'll say that.
Yeah, I mean, it could in a way like be a microcosm, as like BDSM is a play of the power dynamic of society in and of itself, as you were talking about in race play and in sub-dom relationships to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think I see Kimberly's deep thinking face on again. So I don't know if you
I don't have anything to say. I am just deep thinking. I've just had some epiphanies here. I'm in it.
Okay, that's great to hear. That's what I want. Well, that was a really cool answer. Thank you so much, Juliana. Um, I would love to probe that further if anybody in the audience has more questions about that. But we do have another question from Cece, and then I think after this we can start winding down. So this is last call for questions for our two incredible speakers. So from Cece, the question is, what do you imagine are the practices, relationships, productions that will feed this moment and nourish the future for the collective and the individual personal? That might be a fairly large and personal question, but yeah.
On like a super, super micro scale, I've been so fascinated by the rise of people investing in plants, right? Like buying plants, and like obviously I have flowers here, like people bringing the outdoors into their homes when so many of us are like cloistered. I think there is something so fascinating about people. I'm obsessed with like this idea of care, right? Like investing in care and growth, and even seeing the plants that I have in my home like every day, I don't know, grow toward the sun, and like you water it and the next day it's replenished, and there's just something really there's something really soothing and like appealing about being able to care for something and see it grow and see it respond to natural stimuli, to be connected to the earth in that way. And I do think that there is something about those of us who are attached to screen, like literally addicted to screens and addicted to technology, and now because of this pandemic we are afraid to go outside. Being intimate with nature in that way, there's something like, I don't know, there's something there.
Yeah, I think it really does speak to what you were talking about earlier as well, though, of like taking care of one another and taking care of ourselves, and having a relationship with the land is like the first way of doing that. And in divesting, that's really, I like that a lot. Thank you, as a microcosm for the macro. And how about you, Juliana? Do you have an answer?
I guess sort of hopping off that, thinking about the micro, also thinking, because I'm always trying to understand the ways in which we are being subject to different forms of kind of like state or corporate sovereignty. And so thinking about the interior and thinking about kind of disease and hormones and reproductive rights and like and how so much of our relationships to our body and the interior functions of our body are actually the ground on which so much of the political questions that we're thinking about are taking place. And so I think that the movement for like food sovereignty and the kind of taking back traditional medicine and herbalist and revisiting different traditions that are specific to Black people in various parts of the states in the world is something that's really hopeful for me. It's something that's very real, it's very practical, it's immediate, it's very possible for everyone to engage in, presuming that we can challenge things like food deserts. And so I think that kind of health and like bodily care and reorienting our relationship to food, especially as Black people, is something that's exciting, really exciting for me. And from a Southern family, everyone died of heart attack, everyone died of heart attack, heart disease, diabetes, or kind of secondary diseases that resulted that were the result of some sort of inflammatory condition. And so I think food is a radical and necessary front, and I'm excited that that's being taken up by so many care workers and activists and food. My sister's a chef, so she's also she's taken this up as well. But.
Yeah, that does seem like a very material and like great beginning to whatever revolution can happen internally and externally. Taking care of the body is so simple and so pinnacle, and essential to the taking care of ourselves. So yeah, I appreciate that a lot, and also returning back to ways that have been so quote unquote lost. Okay, I have one more question, and then I would like, if you both would be willing, because you've been such wonderful work, like interlocutors with each other, and I think I speak for everyone, it's been really interesting watching you both play off of each other and speak. So I want to ask you both to ask each other a question, or if you have a question for the other, to say so. But before that, we have one last question from Riley Hooker, who had said, I love what you both said about the weaponization of revolution and Black radical language. I was hoping you could both elaborate a bit by sharing some observations or examples of where and how this has played out in culture. And that'll be our ending question before you both ask each other.
Oh gosh. Well, I even think about, I guess because of the name of my platform, people tag me in lots of Harriet Tubman memes. And I'm like, and I always want to be like, but you know, she was fleeing slavery, right? Like when people are like, I don't know, somebody will say like, let's go dark on Facebook for a couple of days. Let's not post on Facebook for a couple of days. Like, what would Harriet do? Or like just really things that I'm just like, but she was fleeing. Like, I mean, it's like you're talking about not going to a restaurant, right? Like equating just to me like very superficial things to this woman who, you know, led dozens of people out of, like, I don't know. I just don't like equating people who are literally sacrificing life and limb, like literally facing death, right? Execution, murder, to like rather trivial like thing. Like, I don't like that, right? And I think that like it again goes to this idea of like we don't really want to deal with the fact that like revolution means violence, like revolution means imminent threats and terror and like being separated from your family, right? Like it's a real thing. It's a serious thing. Okay, I'll stop. But stop misusing Harriet Tubman's image.
And what's that on that? Absolutely. Juliana, the question too.
Pass the mic on that one again.
No, okay. That was a great answer. I also don't know how. All right. I think ending on let's not misuse Harriet Tubman's image, I think is a great note. And with that, Juliana Huxtable, Kimberly Foster, do you have questions you've been dying to ask each other?
I wanted to ask him about your reading practices. Like, what sort of, do you have any rituals? Like, do you read in the morning, every day? Do you have like, what, like, are you a Kindle person? Like, how do you incorporate reading into your life? Because I know you value that a lot, and do the reading is such a part of your platform. And so, yeah, I've always been curious.
Yeah, you know, I get this question a lot because I think it is irresponsible to do a lot of talking and not do a lot of reading. I think it is like just complete malpractice to be out here spewing thoughts all the time when I haven't deeply invested in education. And so I read every morning, every single morning. I don't use physical, I know people get mad when I say I'm not the biggest fan of physical books because it creates clutter, but I'm not. So I do read a lot of digital books like Amazon on the Kindle on my phone or on my laptop. I also try to read a lot of journalism, like not just books, but journalism. I really value and appreciate like the rigor of like investigative journalism, like, you know, like a 15,000 word article. Like I'm so into that. But I just think you have to make time. And I just feel I just feel like it's my duty to do that. And I also know that reading is like, I spend a lot of time just sitting around looking at stuff. Like, that's a privilege. And I do feel like I want to use my privilege for good. So that's what I invest in. That's my answer. Okay, so when you're talking, Juliana, you are making me think, and I think somebody said this in the chat. I had some really visceral reactions to slave play. And when you were talking, I was like, oh, okay, I think I better understand. I think I understand this work better now. Like, I think I understand Jeremy O. Harris better now. And so I'm wondering, like, I'm sure you saw the show.
So I haven't seen it yet. I actually have not seen it yet because I spent so much time in Berlin. I was supposed to go and then got sick and could not make it.
Oh,
but I'm going to see it. I will see it.
Okay, because have you heard about it?
Yes, I know all about it.
Okay, so I'm wondering, like, I think a lot of people's discussed, even people who have not seen the show and have no desire to see the show, the idea of racism, like as a site of pleasure, or slavery, like as an avenue to pleasure, like really, really turns people off in a real way. And so, like, I don't know, is there a way to overcome that or to explain it to people who just on its face, like, are averse to the idea that subjugation and oppression might be a pathway to pleasure on its face?
I mean, I think that's why I'm generally really there's a lot of apprehension around being like, this is revolutionary, like BDSM, slave play BDSM is revolutionary, because I think on the one hand, I think it's too complicated to just make that statement that feels sort of just like ham-handed and not nuanced enough. But also I think in dealing with these things, for me, I want the opportunity for Black people to engage and think about this as a possibility for navigating a lot of the body kind of, because it's for me, it's a question of just like white noise, ubiquitous kind of like expectation, violent expectation precipitating on Black people constantly. And this is a way of sort of confronting and dealing with that. And I think that, like, for example, I think that there would be less outcry surrounding a question of a Black person dominating a white person. Like, if it was sort of like slave play, but the idea behind slave play was reversed, everyone would completely understand that, because I think we understand and we're willing to give a lot of credence to even staged kind of consensual sexual violence if it is in the role of redemption. But to me, like as someone that really values dissidence, there's also there's a dissident desire that's inherent to that. So if we can understand and get behind the kind of redemptive or narrative, like I think that we should also be able to try to understand the reverse. And I've also thought, like historically, to me, this is kind of related to, despite the fact that, yes, there's the sort of like Black men are always with white women, whatever, there is a kind of social acceptance. Like growing up in the South, it was totally accepted for like the Black men that are perceived in positions of power, whether that be like a star academic, whether that be a star football player, to have white girlfriends. And the kind of sexual act, at least from a lot of Black people, they could understand that because he presumably is in the position of power, if we're operating on our most crass assumptions about sexuality. But the idea that a Black woman would engage in any sort of sexual interaction with a white man was just absolutely no. There was this really hard taboo. And in my family, I found that so strange, where like my brother could bring home like white girls, light-skinned Latina girls, whatever, totally accepted. But the idea that me or my sister or I would subject ourselves to kind of like whiteness as any sort of, even just in terms of the literal dynamics of what one would presume would be penetrative sex, that it's not allowed. And so for me, I'm kind of almost intuitively attracted to that, just as a dissident desire that's being policed, and also as a way in which heterosexual Black women who choose to engage in interracial relations are inherently punished in a way that I don't think is the same for Black men. So there's also that angle that's kind of coming into it. But the over-identification question was really necessary to me. And so I did this, like, I first wrote this text. So I had these sets of this set of experiences, which was also related to like research that I had been doing. I was thinking about depictions of slavery in film, like Goodbye Uncle Tom. And so I was doing a lot of really trying to understand like what the power dynamics being represented in these like films and writing and online communities are, and then how to understand this experience that I had. And so I wrote it as a performance that I first did in LA, and there was a lot of Black women a lot of Black people, but a lot of Black women in the audience. And I was like, oh my God, like, I hope this goes okay. Like, I'm really nervous, but I think that, like, afterwards, so many Black women came up to me and were just like, wow, actually, like, thank you for that, because even if I found parts of it difficult to interface with, I understood, and something like I interface with that, and I'm thankful that I got to encounter this. But I think the difference between like what was happening then in slave pay, at least on one level, is that it's placed in kind of explicitly in this historical precedent of how sexual violence is seen as redemptive, or at least in some sort of almost like a form of justice. You know what I mean? As long as Black people are in the position of power, it's somehow a form of justice versus the reverse. And so I think explaining it in that way maybe enabled the other parts of the performance to be understood differently, because it was kind of, the performance itself was also an exposition of like the research that I was obsessed with at the time. Because I do think for me, it would have felt, while provocative, maybe a little bit irresponsible or just alienating to Black people who I wanted to be able to engage it, if I just threw the images and just threw the content of just like, a white man is now the slave master. Like, that wouldn't feel.
Yeah, I get you. I get it.
I'm just, wow. Thank you for that ending conversation. That was also, Juliana, I can send you my copy of Slave Play if you send me a copy of Mucus in My Pineal Gland.
Totally, I have a PDF. We can do a trade.
Sounds good. All right, well, with that, I'm so glad this was recorded, because I'm gonna watch this like 3 more times. But I want to say thank you so much for accepting our invitation to come to this talk today. It's been an honor being in the space with you, and all these people I love, and all these people are part of the community. And I really hope you two stay in conversation. And I can't wait to see what either of you do henceforth. And yeah, thank you so much. I don't know how else I can express that.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Roger, would you like to say any final remarks?
I want to thank both of you, Kimberly and Juliana, for coming back, or Juliana for coming back, and Kimberly for joining us, and Sky for moderating in a great way. We'll have another conversation, I said Thursday, in the same series, Race and Revolution, with Kenyon Adams and Reverend Jackie Lewis, which is going to be great as well. So I hope to see you all Thursday. Thank you guys for an amazing conversation, and have a good night, everyone.